Good evening children and welcome to Yupp Master. These are our foundation classes and we are starting with today the internal structure of the human heart. So we started a chapter of the transport system. Until now we have completed the topics of blood where we studied the parts of blood. We also completed the topic of the external structure of the heart. So before we go on today towards the internal structure, okay, let's just have a brief outlook of what we have done in yesterday's lecture. Alright, so just a quick recap of the external structure of the heart. Always remember that, do you remember what was the actual covering of the heart called as? There was a covering which was all around the heart, and I told you, if it is all around, then the word that we're going to be using, what was that word for all around? Didn't I call it as peri? So, a covering all around the heart can be called as the pericardium. Do you remember that? Also, we learnt about the three walls of the heart too. And those three walls of the heart were the outer, the middle and the inner, right? Which were those three names? Since it was dealing about the heart, all the three words were ending with cardium, right? So, there was cardium at the end. The outermost layer was called as the epicardium. Okay, the middle one, okay, the middle one was also ending with cardium. But if you remember, I told you that this is the layer which is made up of muscles. And if it is made up of muscles, you can call it as a myocardium. Okay, so that's epicardium, then comes myocardium. And finally, the innermost layer is also cardium. Alright, and that being the inner one would be called as the endocardium. So, all of these three put together were the three walls of the heart. Okay, these were the three walls of the heart. And what was the covering of the heart called as? It was called as the pericardium. Do you remember how much was the weight of the heart? It was around 250 to 300 grams. Okay, 250 to 300 grams. All right, now let's continue. We started with the external structure of the heart, identifying the four chambers which are present in the heart. Okay, which are those four chambers? Tell me those. Those four chambers would be the two superior chambers. Okay, the two superior chambers, what were they called as? Does anyone remember what they were called as? Those were called as atria. So you have two atria, and then the inferior chambers which were larger, those were called as the two ventricles. Okay, remember that the two atria were superior, small, they were thin walled, and they were chambers which were, what was the function of them? Do you remember that? They did the function of bringing in blood. Blood was taken in by them. So that's why we call those chambers as the receiving chambers. Receiving chambers. Whereas when we talk about the ventricles, these are the chambers which are going to be bringing, or rather taking blood out of the heart. So that's why ventricles can be referred to as the distributing chambers. Okay, so these were the distributing chambers. So basically you remember that the four chambers, two atria, two ventricles are completely separated from one another. Alright. Now after the four chambers in external structure, we saw that there were two grooves. Does anyone remember those names of those two grooves? Yes. First groove was present between the atria and ventricle. So we called it as the atrioventricular groove. And then the next groove was present between the two ventricles. So we called it as the interventricular sulcus. Remember that sulcus and groove basically mean the same thing. Now why were these depressions present? In order to accommodate the blood vessels of the heart. The blood vessels of the heart were known as the coronaries, the coronary artery and the coronary veins. Alright, so those are these over here. So when we're talking about the coronary veins, let's talk about the veins right now. Okay, so here are all those coronary veins put together. Okay, now can you see here that all these coronary veins have joined together to form this bulge like apparatus. Okay, this bulging structure here is what we're going to be calling as the coronary sinus. And what does that coronary sinus do? That sinus is going to take all the deoxygenated blood of the heart and it will be putting it inside the right atrium. Which atrium? Inside the right atrium. Because inside the right atrium. Because we see that in the right atrium, today we will be learning about that. In the right atrium, deoxygenated blood from all the parts of the body are going to be collecting inside that. All right, so that's the work of the coronary sinus. All right, now let's see ahead. When we talk about the important blood vessels which are seen on the external surface of the heart, there were 4 blood vessels which we studied yesterday. All right, let's go and label those. First one, this one over here, this was called as the superior vena cava. Second one, this one over here, this one was called as the inferior vena cava. Then this part over here, okay, I'll do it with a green color, this part that we're seeing here, this part here was called as the pulmonary trunk. What was it called as? It was called as the pulmonary trunk. Okay, that's pulmonary trunk. All right, and after that, this whole region over here, the biggest one here, this in fact is the largest artery in the whole body, and that artery, the largest one in the whole body, was called as the aorta. So the 4 important blood vessels which we saw on the external surface of the heart were, first, what was the first one? It was called as the superior vena cava. Second one being the inferior vena cava. Third one being the pulmonary trunk, and the fourth one being the aorta. So these was those 4 important blood vessels seen on the external surface. Now, we began yesterday with the internal surface of the heart, right? I also told you that while studying the internal surface, okay, we're going to be dividing this whole topic into 3 parts, all right? Which are those 3 parts? This is what we need to remember. First, remember, in internal surface of the heart, the very first topic we are going to be learning about is about the atria, okay? So we're going to begin our answer talking about the atria, all right? Now, after the atria, the second thing is not the ventricles. In fact, it is an apparatus which is present between atria and ventricles. So, that apparatus can be called as the atrioventricular. Atrioventricular apparatus. Okay, then the third one, the one below, the chambers below. We're going to be talking about the internal structure of those ventricles. Okay, so the below chambers are the ventricles. So we have this whole topic divided into 3 regions. First being the atria, second being the atrioventricular apparatus, and third we will be learning about the ventricles. Okay, now let us begin our answer of internal structure of the heart while we talk initially about only the atria. Now when we talk about the atria, okay, talking about only atria, we're going to begin our answer with, first we're going to begin it as the right atrium. Okay, after the right atrium, we see that there is a separation between the right and left atrium. So the second part of the answer will be about the septum, that is between the atria. If it is a septum between the atria, may I call this as an interatrial septum. What's the meaning of septum? Septum is nothing but a separation. Okay, so our answer will begin first with the right atrium, second with the interatrial septum, and third it will be concluding with the left atrium. Okay, the left atrium. So the whole atria structure is divided into 3 parts. Let's begin with the first part. Okay, first I told you that both the atria are divided by an interatrial septum. Okay, also one thing is there to be seen here, that the right atrium, okay, this is the right atrium. Please remember the sides of the heart. Okay, this side being the right side and this side of the heart being the left side. All right, why is that? Remember I told you in yesterday's lecture that whenever we're going to be labeling a zoology diagram, you have to imagine that the diagram that you are drawing is actually that body part located in the person or the patient in front of you. So now looking at this screen, when you see the heart, imagine that this is a heart of a person who is standing right in front of you. And wouldn't this side be the right side of that person? And wouldn't this side be the left side of that person, right? So we're going to be labeling exactly opposite of what is looking like for you on your paper, all right? You can also see that the right side of the atrium, the right atrium is slightly larger than the left atrium, okay? Now, why is that right atrium slightly larger than the left atrium? Because first of all, this septum which is present between them, that septum is directed towards the left. So, if the septum is going to be directed towards the left side, this would automatically make the right side chamber slightly larger than the left side. Okay. Also, one thing remember that the right sided chamber, which chamber? The right atrium. Okay. That right atrium needs to be big enough in order to hold all that deoxygenated blood which is coming from various parts of the body. So, first, I would just like you to know that when we're studying about the atria, between the right atrium and the left atrium, there is a septum in between them in order to prevent the mixing of blood over there. Okay, so that is the interatrial septum. Now, when we talk about the right atrium, this atrium is going to be receiving which kind of blood? Only and only deoxygenated blood. I'm talking about the hollow part of the heart, the internal part. It is going to be receiving deoxygenated blood. Where from? Let's see that. First, all the structures which are located above the heart. Okay, I'm talking about the regions of your shoulders, regions of your neck, of your head. All of these places, all the deoxygenated blood from them will be taken to the heart. From where? From this blood vessel over here. And you already know the name of that blood vessel, don't you? That is called as the superior vena cava, wasn't it? What about all the structures below the heart? For all the structures below the heart, the deoxygenated blood will be taken towards the heart through this vessel over here, which I'm going to be calling as the inferior vena cava. So, you have superior vena cava and then you have inferior vena cava. Okay, then what about the heart itself? I told you that even the heart requires oxygen. So, it will be giving out carbon dioxide as well. So, what do we see here? That the heart's carbon dioxide blood, the heart's deoxygenated blood also needs to enter into the heart so that it can become oxygenated. And where is it entering from? From this region over here. Can you see this region over here? This is going to be an opening for the heart's deoxygenated blood. And if you remember, the heart's deoxygenated blood is being brought by the coronary veins. And also, if you remember, the coronary veins are going to be joining and they are forming a structure which is called as the coronary sinus. Okay, now this coronary sinus is going to open into the right atrium. Do you remember that? So we see here that structures opening into the right atrium in order to take the deoxygenated blood from the whole body are three structures. The first structure being the superior vena cava, okay. The second structure being the inferior vena cava, alright, and the third structure being the coronary sinus. Okay, so here we have got three structures which are responsible for bringing all that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Alright, so that was our first right atrium. Next, let's move forward. When we see the interatrial septum, okay, after right atrium, we come towards the interatrial septum. On this interatrial septum, we see that in the fetal heart, okay, during fetal stage. What is a fetal stage? Fetal stage means when the baby is still inside mama's womb. During that stage, we see that there is a hole in the heart, okay. Can you see over here? Alright, I'll mark it with a red color. Can you see this whole region here? This actually, what is appearing green over here, this is actually a hole which is present in the heart of fetus. Okay. Now this hole, why is it present? It is present because, always remember, as I told you yesterday, fetal lungs. Which lungs? Fetal lungs. Fetal lungs are completely non-functional. Okay. Fetal lungs are non-functional, and if fetal lungs are non-functional, imagine if the deoxygenated blood entered here And then if that blood is taken down, instead of going on the left side, if that blood is taken downwards, then what will happen? From this ventricle, it will go here and it would be taken to the lungs. But fetal lungs are non-functional, so there is no use of doing that. That's why in the fetal heart, in that septum which is present between the two atria, there is going to be a hole. And that hole will allow blood to be traveling from the right side to the left side of the heart. Okay, so that it can reach the different parts of the body very quickly. Alright, so in the fetus, we see that there is a presence of a hole or an apparate or a small opening between the two atria, which is going to be called as the foramen ovale. What is it called as? It's called as foramen ovale, where foramen means opening, okay, a hole, and ovale because it is oval in shape. So that is foramen ovale. Alright. Now, this is of the fetus, okay, so this is how it looks in fetal stage. But always remember, after birth, this structure will not be present at all. In fact, that hole needs to be completely covered as soon as the baby is born. Because if that hole is not covered, this is what results in the remaining of a hole in the heart. You might have heard in many children that there is a hole in the heart, where in these kind of children, immediately we would have to be performing any surgeries in order to take care of that hole in the heart. Because if there is a hole in the heart, this would result in mixing of blood, and we cannot at all afford to have our deoxygenated blood mixed with our oxygenated blood. Okay, so that is a fetal structure present only before birth. And what is that structure called as? It was called as foramen ovale. All right, so if you remember, we are talking about the atrium. We are done with the right atrium. We are done with the septum between them. Now we move on towards the left atrium. In order to view what are the structures entering into the left atrium, let's just spin this heart around. Okay, we see the back side of the heart. Now, on the back side of the heart, can you see how look here? Can you see how there are 4 arteries here? Okay, so look at this part here. I'll mark it with this color here. All right, so can you see there is one, this is the second one, this being the third one, and this being the fourth one. Okay, so we see here that in the left atrium, okay, in the left atrium, oxygenated blood is supplied to this atrium from the lungs. And how is it coming from the lungs? It is coming from the lungs through 4 pulmonary veins. Okay, and these are those 4 pulmonary veins. One, this is the second one, this is the third one, and this is the fourth one. So there are 4 pulmonary veins which are responsible for carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. So this will give you a brief understanding that when we're talking about the right side of the heart, it is all dealing about deoxygenated blood. And when we're talking about the left side of the heart, it is going to be dealing about oxygenated blood. Alright. So we see that this oxygenated blood from the lungs taken to the heart through 4 pulmonary veins. Remember that generally when we're talking about veins are always indicating deoxygenated blood. But this vein here, it's being brought from the lungs. Because it is removing blood from the lungs, it is called as a vein. And because it is coming from the lungs, it is called as pulmonary. Okay, so any structure which takes blood away from a organ would be called as vein. And because it is taking blood away from the lungs, it is called as pulmonary vein. So this in fact is an exception to all the veins in our body, where this is the only vein which is responsible for carrying oxygenated blood, whereas all other veins are going to be carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, so that was the pulmonary veins. Now, after the atria, so we're done with the atrial structures, right? We're done with the right atrium, we're done with the septum in between, and we are done with the left atrium. In the right atrium, we discussed all about the deoxygenated blood, where all is it coming from. In the septum, we discussed about the fetal structure. And in the left atrium, we also discussed about how oxygenated blood is being brought into it. Alright, so we're done with the atrium part. Coming towards the second part of our answer, that is the atrioventricular apparatus, which means that I am talking about those structures which are present between the atria and the ventricles. Okay, I'm talking about these structures which I've just circled on that sheet right now. Okay, so let's see what these structures are all about and how they look like. So talking about this atrioventricular apparatus, there are two apparatus. Okay, the first apparatus, this one over here on the right side. Okay, so this one on the right side, and then there is one on the left side. Okay, so let's take one at a time. Let us begin with the right atrioventricular aperture, or you may call it as the right AV aperture. Okay, now when you take a good look at this part, I'm talking only about this part over here. Okay, taking a good look at it, this whole region has got three flaps. Okay, can you see these flaps over here? Something like this. There is 1, 2 and 3. Well, these three flaps, okay, these flaps can also be called as cusps. What can they called as? They can be called as cusps, alright. These cusps are actually going to make sure that blood is going to be flowing from atria into the ventricles, and also they will take care that blood does not flow back upwards. Okay, so they are making sure that blood is flowing only in a downward direction, does not flow back upwards. Okay, so we have here on the right side, because this apparatus is made up of three cusps or three valve-like structures. Okay, so this, or three membrane-like structures, that's why this is called as the tricuspid valve. What is it called as? We'll call this valve. Okay, we will call this valve which has 1, 2 and 3 cusps. We'll call that as the tricuspid valve. Okay, now if I'm talking about a valve, then all valves in our body are meant to do one basic function. That is, they are going to be meant to prevent any backflow of blood. They will not allow blood to backflow back into the atrium, will not happen. Okay, so that was on the right side. Coming next to the left side, the left atrioventricular aperture, let's see what that is made up of. This part of the aperture is made up of two cusps, one here and the second one here. So because there are two cusps here, I will now call this as a bicuspid valve. Bicuspid valve. Okay, and this bicuspid valve can also be called as the mitral valve. Okay, it can also be called as the mitral valve. So, the bicuspid or the mitral valve is located on the left side over here. Okay, more importantly, you need to remember that for MCQs, it is going to be always called as mitral valve. Okay, mitral valve. Now, what is this going to do? Again, the very same function. If it is a valve, it is going to be preventing backflow. Okay, now, we also see that these valves, okay, whether it is the tricuspid valve on the right side, or we're talking about the mitral valve on the left side, these valves are going to be anchored down to the walls of the ventricles. Okay, so they are anchored down. What is it that's anchoring them down? Let's see those. Can you see these muscles over here? I'll draw it with a green color. Alright, look at these muscles here. Can you see those here? All of these muscles, okay, these are the muscles which are called as the papillary muscles, okay, and these papillary muscles are behaving as anchorages, okay. They are making sure that the valves of, or these cusps which are there of the apparatus are going to open only in a downward direction, because you don't want those cusps, you don't want those flaps to be opening in an upward direction. So they're always going to be opening downwards so that blood only flows down. And what is it that's holding that? What is it that is connecting the valves with these papillary muscles? There are cords present there, and those cords are called as the chordae tendineae. Let's see how those chordae tendineae look like. Okay, can you see those cords over there? All right, let's see here in this diagram. These cords here, okay, I'll show you here. These structures that you're seeing here, all of these structures are called as the chordae tendineae. Okay, what are they doing? These chordae tendineae, they are going to be attaching the valves with these papillary muscles. Can you see this muscle here? This is the papillary muscle below it. Okay, So this is the chordae tendineae, and what was the name of the muscle? That muscle was called as the papillary muscle. Okay, they're called as papillary muscles. All right. Now next, talking about the third structure. Okay, we're done with the atria. We are done with the atrioventricular aperture. We now move on towards the ventricles. Okay, talking about the ventricles, we're going to begin with the definition of ventricles. These were the inferior, the large, the thick walled, and the ventricles were the chambers which were distributing blood. Okay, so these were inferior, large, thick walled, all right, and these were distributing chambers. All right. Okay, so that was all about the what the basic definition of ventricles was. Now, just like how we saw that there is a septum between the two atria, similarly, there is also a septum which is present between the two ventricles. And where is it? Look at right here. This part that you're seeing over here, this is the septum between the two ventricles. Since it is a septum between the two ventricles, may I call this as the interventricular septum. Alright. So this is that interventricular septum present so that there is no mixing of blood between the two ventricles. Alright. So that's interventricular septum. Now, let us come to let's come to the left side of the ventricles. Okay. Now, what do we see here? That left side of the ventricle, I'm talking about the left ventricular wall. What am I talking about? This part over here. This part that I'm highlighting over here. Can you see that as compared to the walls of any other part of the body, can you see that this seems to be the thickest of them all? Okay. Look at the other walls or look at the other walls of other parts of the heart. Look at this part here. Look at how thin this is. Okay. Look at this part here. Even this one is so thin. Even you can see the other ventricle, that is the right ventricle. Can you see how thin even that wall is? But then look at that huge structure that we just spoke about over here. This wall, can you see how thick that is? And what is the reason for this wall to be the thickest? The reason being that this is the chamber which has got blood. Which blood? It has got oxygenated blood. Okay. It's got oxygenated blood, and this oxygenated blood needs to be forced. It needs to be pumped so forcefully so that the blood inside can reach to all the different parts of the body. All right. So here we've got oxygenated blood, and when the muscles will contract, which muscles? I'm talking about this muscles here. When these muscles will contract, then it is going to contract with such force that it will be able to push that oxygenated blood out of the body, so out of the heart, so that it can reach all the different parts of the body. All right. So this left ventricular wall is the thickest amongst all the different chambers. Okay, it's the thickest amongst all the different chambers. Now, when we talk about the inner surface of the ventricles, I'd like you to have a look about this region that I'm highlighting over here. I'm talking about this region here. Can you see this region, how it is thrown into small folds? Do you see those folds over there? Okay, well, all these folds over there, okay, they are just meant to increase the surface area of the ventricles so that it can accommodate more and more amount of blood if and when required. So it is said to be that the inner surface of the ventricles is thrown into these ridges and these irregular ridges over there, okay, and they're all muscular. So these irregular series of ridges that we are able to see inside the walls of the ventricles can be called as columnae carneae, or we may also call them as trabeculae carneae. Once again, have a look at which region I'm talking about. I'm talking about these markings that you're seeing here. Okay, this marking over here. All of these structures that you're seeing here, can you see these are actually nothing but they are actually projections which are going to be there, and they are just ridges which are present which can accommodate more and more blood. They can be called as the columnae carneae, or they can be called as the trabeculae carne. Okay, columnae carne or trabeculae carne. Alright. Next, we're talking about the right ventricle. So, when we talked about the ventricles, we began with the left side and then we will go on towards the right side. Alright. Now, you tell me, when I'm talking about the right side of the heart, which blood am I talking about? Is it oxygenated or is it deoxygenated? Yes, right side of the heart means compulsory we're talking about deoxygenated. Okay, deoxygenated blood. So, talking about this right ventricle, there is deoxygenated blood. And what is it? This deoxygenated blood, where does it have to go? That has to be taken towards the lungs. And how is it taken towards the lungs? It is taken towards the lungs by the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so let's get working on there. When we're talking about here, let's say there is deoxygenated blood filled here. Okay, all of this region, this is deoxygenated blood over here. This deoxygenated blood, okay, where did it come from? It came from the right atrium. So, from the right atrium, the deoxygenated blood has now collected into the right ventricle. And from the right ventricle, that blood needs to be taken towards the pulmonary trunk. Okay, and it has to be then taken towards the lungs. So, that blood from the pulmonary trunk, it's taken towards the lungs. So, this structure over here, which we are talking about, from the right ventricle, deoxygenated blood is taken towards the lungs by an external structure. Do you remember which that was? It was called as the pulmonary trunk. Okay, remember it is all deoxygenated blood because we are dealing with the right side. Alright. Now, coming back to the left ventricle. Which kind of blood is present in the left ventricle? Wasn't it oxygenated blood which has come from the lungs? So, this oxygenated blood needs to be carried out to the whole body. And in order to carry that oxygenated blood to the whole body, how is it going to go? It's going to be going out through this structure here. And which was this blood vessel? Remember, we learned the name of it, and it was the largest artery of the body, and it was called as the aorta. Okay, so, and where does that aorta going to be leading to? It's going to be leading to the body. So, we can say that from the left ventricle, oxygenated blood will be carried to the whole body by the aorta. Alright, I hope that made sense. So, on one side, let's see this whole heart structure here. Okay. We'll clear it out. Okay, on one side, we have which blood on the right side? On the right side over here, we've got deoxygenated blood. Okay, so that deoxygenated blood has to be carried to the lungs. Okay, and how is it being carried to the lungs? By the pulmonary trunk. Okay, what about the next side? This side over here has got oxygenated blood, has to be carried to the whole body. Okay, to the body. And who is going to be carrying it? It is going to be carried by this structure here, which is called as the aorta. Alright, so I hope that makes things clear. Always remember that on the right side of the heart, okay, it is deoxygenated. Okay, and on the left side of the heart, it is oxygenated. Okay, always remember over here it is blue and over here it is red. Okay, alright. Now, coming to one more type of valve which is present inside the heart. Remember, if it is a valve, then what function is it going to do? It's going to be preventing backflow of blood. Okay, so now let's see how this is happening. When we're talking about these valves here, look at this structure here. First structure I'm talking about over here. When we're talking about this blood, which blood is this? This is the deoxygenated blood. This deoxygenated blood is going to be carried towards this pulmonary trunk and goes to the lungs, right? But what happens is, slowly as the deoxygenated blood lessens over here, okay, as soon as it becomes very less, let's say it's become so less that it's only this much now left. Okay, now what has happened? The pressure inside, or the pressure of the blood inside the pulmonary trunk is going to be higher than that inside the ventricles. Correct? The pressure of the blood in the trunk is going to be higher than that of the blood in the ventricles. So naturally what will happen? A tendency will develop that the deoxygenated blood might backflow down. And do you want that blood to be flowing back down? No, we don't. So in order to prevent that backflow of blood, what do? We will put a valve. Okay, when you put a valve over there, it's going to be preventing the backflow. And the valve over there has got 3 cusps. How many cusps? 3 cusps. And all of those cusps are half moon shaped. Okay, they are half moon shaped. And because they are half moon shaped, they can also be called as the semilunar valves. Lunar meaning moon shaped, semi meaning half. Okay, so there is a semilunar valve at the base of the pulmonary trunk. There is also a semilunar valve at the base of the aorta. What are these structures going to do? Whenever the ventricles will contract, that time these semilunar valves will prevent blood from flowing back down into the ventricles, because we don't want that backflow of blood to be happening ever. Alright. So that was the work of these semilunar valves. Okay. So now children, we have completed the whole structure of the internal structure of the heart. Alright. Now in this internal structure, let's just quickly revise, because this is such an important question. Let's just quickly revise how was our whole answer situated. Okay. So first we begin with the internal. Look at this on the board, what I'm writing. I'm starting with the internal structure of our heart. Okay, remember that this whole answer was divided into 3 regions. Okay, which were those regions? Let me write that in blue. The first region was the atria. Okay, the second region was called as the atrioventricular aperture, and the third region was the ventricles. Okay, so now these are the 3 regions: 1 atria, 2 AV aperture, 3 ventricles. Alright, let's continue. When we talked about the atria, the first thing that we learnt about was about the right atrium. So we're going to be beginning with the right atrium. Alright, after that we spoke about the interatrial septum. Interatrial septum, didn't we? And after that we learnt about the left atrium. Alright, then we came towards the AV aperture. When we spoke about the AV aperture or the atrioventricular aperture, this aperture had on the right side, first on the right side, there was a tricuspid valve. Okay, on the left side, it was called as a bicuspid, or what else can we call it as? Remember, it can also be called as mitral valve. Okay, bicuspid or mitral valve. Then these valves were held to the floor of the ventricles. And what were the muscles present on the floor of the ventricles? Weren't they called as the papillary muscles? The papillary muscles. Okay, and those papillary muscles were held together by cords, and those cords were called as chordae tendineae. They were called as chordae tendineae. Okay, so that was all about the AV aperture, atrioventricular aperture. Third, going downwards, we speak about the ventricles. Okay, now these ventricles, if we see, we first began with the left ventricle. Okay, when we speak about the left ventricle, it had the thickest wall. Remember that? It had the thickest wall. Alright. Then we spoke about the different, when the ventricles are pumping, where exactly is blood going out from. Okay, so we saw here that talking about the right side of the ventricle, okay, which blood did it have? That right ventricle, it had deoxygenated blood. Okay, that deoxygenated blood goes from, what is the pathway of deoxygenated blood? It goes from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk and finally taken towards the lungs. Okay, but then what about the left ventricle? When I talk about the left ventricle, okay, let's see this here. The left ventricle, which blood am I talking about? I'm talking about oxygenated blood. Okay, and now when I talk about this oxygenated blood, it is going to be flowing from the left ventricle towards the aorta, okay, and then it will be taken to all the parts of our body. All right, so I hope that makes this whole thing straight, where we're talking about the different parts of the internal structure of the heart, okay, the atria, the AV aperture, and the ventricles. This is just a flow chart of how you can remember this answer, since it is a quite lengthy answer, okay, and it just breaks it up so that it becomes easier for you for your answer writing. All right, so this here, atria, AV aperture, ventricles. Remember the external structure. Remember the four main structures which are present, the four main vessels which are present, the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. Then we spoke about the pulmonary trunk, and then we spoke about the aorta. All right. Remember the names of the four valves which we studied, right? Which were those valves? On the right side, there was a tricuspid valve. On the left side, there was a bicuspid valve. One more valve we didn't mention about. Do you remember that one? It was the ones which were looking like a half moon shaped valves. And didn't we call those valves as the semilunar valves? They were called as the semilunar valves. And what did these semilunar valves do? How many were there? There were two of them, right? Each of those semilunar valves were having three cusps. And how many valves were there? Two of them. One was at the base of, the pulmonary trunk, and second at the base of systemic aorta. Alright, so we have all of these valves present, the four important vessels, the four important valves that you have for preventing. Remember what was the function of valve? If at all ever you have a valve present, that valve is always going to be preventing backflow. Okay, that is the work of a valve. Okay, it will always be preventing the backflow in that region. So children, this sums up our lecture for today, where we learned all about the different structures present in the internal structure of the heart. Okay, now remember that this platform is open for you all day. Anytime you have a doubt, do post your doubts on our Yupp Master platform, and do share this with your friends also, so that even they can come and enjoy these lectures with you as well. All right, so until we meet in tomorrow's lecture, you guys stay home, stay safe, and do go through this whole answer of the internal structure of the heart. See you guys tomorrow. Bye bye.